Okay, so I guess we are live now on YouTube as well. And it's my pleasure to introduce all of you Gareth Roberts. He was very kind to accept our invitation to give a seminar in our department. For those who don't know you, which I think it's unlikely, but anyways, probably see him around if you're Bayesian. Has a very strong mathematical background in probability, and is a specialist in MCMC. And he has been developing very high level technology for MCMC in very complex problems and so on. So if you work with MCMC, I'm really sure you know his name. And I'm very happy to have you here. And talking about football, there is one thing that both England and English and Brazilian people will like to hear for sure. And it's our pleasure to have you here and for you to accept our invitation. I won't be longer than that, so we can get to the talk and listen to you. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Marcos, and it's lovely to see old friends and new friends and collaborators and whatever. And I've always wanted to give this talk in Brazil, which I very much regard as the home of football these days. So, yeah. So what? Can you see my slides? By the way, have I successfully shared my slides? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So this is work I've been involved in for 2 or 3 years now, and it's kind of ongoing. And I'll say something about the ongoing work right at the end. But I'm going to try and give something of an introduction as to the kind of simulation methodology that underlies it at the beginning of it. And then I think most of the talk will be really essentially talking explicitly about football draws themselves. Okay, this is joint work with my close friend and collaborator Jeff Rosenthal, and it's really going to concentrate on the 2022 World Cup draw organized by FIFA, which of course England and Brazil and 30 other countries were involved in. But actually, the sort of concepts that come up are sort of generic and apply to many other draws. Some of the other draws much more complicated, in fact. Okay, so draws. Okay, so draws in May. So football is fairly unique in the respect that it has such a global interest and such a massive sport that even the draw for a major football competition commands a massive audience. For instance, the televised draw of the 2022 World Cup is estimated to have an audience, a live audience of over 200 million people. And that's obviously a lot more people actually will have watched the football itself, but lots of people were actually watching the draw, interested in how their team was, what their team was going to be drawn into, whether the hard group or a difficult group, etc. However, there's a long history of the football authorities getting draws not correct for many reasons. I mean, so perhaps, I mean, if you're interested in this, perhaps the most interesting is if you go and Google the 1982 World Cup draw, it was really a complete shambles. And interestingly, I mean, I haven't been able to find out exactly what FIFA were doing there, but they were trying to implement some kind of auxiliary variable simulation method to carry out the draw, and it turned out to be a complete disaster for various reasons. It's actually quite comical. If you watch the video online, it's very funny. But more recently, the 2021 UEFA Champions League draw, last 16, had to be redone because of an error that was perceived in the possible teams that went into the pot where the balls were drawn from. And an interesting thing that I sort of discovered after seeing that 2021 draw was that actually the draw that they ultimately replaced it by, the corrected draw, actually had biases which are probably at least as large as the biases in the draw that they actually carried out. So it turns out that because of various quirks in the way draws are done, largely due to sort of non-symmetry, things like if you're a European team, then there are many, many other European teams. If you're a South American team, then there's still a reasonable number of other European teams, typically about 4 or so. But if you're from another continent, then there will be a different number of other teams that you may or may not be able to play against. And because of restrictions as to who you can and can't play against, there's a non-symmetric way in which teams like England might be treated and teams like how Brazil might be treated. So actually coming up with even the concept of what is a fair or unfair draw is not completely clear cut. But as statisticians, we should be clear that the only sensible notion of a fair draw should be to have a uniform distribution over all permissible draws. And so I guess really this talk is all about, to the extent to which football authorities actually manage to make their draws close to this uniform distribution. And if they don't, then how can you actually correct for that? Okay, so it really is to do with lack of symmetry. And so there are many simpler draws and perhaps draws without constraints for which it's very easy to come up with a sequential method of doing the draw, which is completely fair. So this talks all about what goes wrong and how you can solve these methods using retrospective simulation. And I know there's at least one expert in the audience on retrospective simulation. So I'll go through some, but most of you probably won't have seen these kind of techniques. So I'll say something about these at the beginning of the talk. So what is retrospective simulation? In principle, it's a very simple idea. It's just essentially you take your favorite simulation algorithms, maybe MCMC, maybe rejection sampling, maybe some other algorithms, in fact, and you essentially just subvert the traditional order of the steps in the algorithm. And it seems like a very simple thing to do, but if you could do this effectively, very often you can massively decrease the computing cost of the simulations that you do. Or in particular, you can sometimes make a computational task which might have in principle been infinite if you'd done it in one order, and actually change the order of the computation and actually make the computing cost actually finite. And in fact, Flavio, who's in the audience, is an expert on doing exactly the simulation algorithms to do exactly this. It turns out to have very close links to various other methodologies in simulation world, and I just mentioned some at the bottom. Okay, so I think sort of somehow hidden in my brain, many years ago when I was a child, was the ideas behind retrospective simulation. And so I don't know if this was common in Brazil in the 1970s. Probably most of you are too young to know anything about the 1970s and the 1980s. But it was the advent of sort of online live television in the UK, and there were television programs in which there were kind of quizzes in which kind of in particular children might be asked a question, and they would be incentivized to send in by postcard the answer to this question, and the question would then and then the following week the same program would then basically announce well there will be a winner. And these particular programs were very popular to the extent that there were literally sort of millions of children basically filling in postcards and sending in the answer to the question. The questions were designed to be easy and to encourage children to also participate. And also, because we were talking about 1970s and 1980s, there wasn't sort of the loads of other things that kids can get distracted by today. And that sort of live television on a Saturday morning maybe was about the only thing that children had to entertain themselves. So the question would be, I've actually translated this into a sort of Brazilian context here. So this is my Brazilian question. So which top Brazilian goalkeeper plays for Liverpool? Now, some of you may know the answer to this question. Some of you may not know the answer to this question. And one thing that characterized the question was always that there was one really stupid answer, and you could decide among yourselves which is the stupid answer. And there was also maybe perhaps one answer which was kind of reasonable but not quite right. I think I've misspelt one of those names as well. Anyway, never mind. Anyway, so the idea, this is what the BBC did, is they invited the children to enter the competition. So you might have N children actually entering their answer on a postcard. Most of them would have got the answer correct, even if they didn't know the answer to the question. They probably would have asked their parents, and then the parents would have told them the answer. So most of them would have had it correct. And essentially what the BBC did was that they essentially went through each of the N competitors, decided which ones were actually got the question right, and put all of the correct cards into a massive big bucket. And then they would get a celebrity to come onto the television program at the following week, and all very exciting. They'll pull out one of the winning postcard, one of the correct postcards, and read out the answer, and that would be that. And I always thought that this was very wasteful for the BBC, because the BBC basically had to go for a massive effort in essentially deciding which of the maybe 500,000 postcards or whatever actually had the answer correct. So a massive amount of manpower was used in actually sorting this out. So it seemed to me that there's a much better idea. I mean, rather than actually checking these, what they should do instead is to, so this is the algorithm one. This is essentially what the BBC did. So they mark each of the N entries, the correct ones put into a bucket. You shake the bucket and pick out one correct card. Okay, and that's obviously a procedure that's going to be order N in computation, because you actually need to check every single entry. Okay, but the other algorithm, which seems much more sensible, is to basically not bother with any of the marking and just basically pull out postcards from the bucket without bothering to mark them. Okay, and if it turns out you pull one out and that the answer's incorrect and they've said Bolsonaro, then actually what all you do is you basically discard that postcard, and then you essentially you try again. So the cost of that procedure, obviously, it's just a geometric distribution. The cost of that procedure is order p to the -1. And since we're expecting p to be pretty large, maybe well over a half, this is going to be very small. Of course, the problem with algorithm 2 is that since it's live television, and you sort of announce, you pull a card out and the card says Bolsonaro, and you say, oh, Flavio Gonçalves has actually announced that it's the answer to this is actually going to be Bolsonaro. He will be sort of unfortunately ridiculed in front of the whole population of Brazil. So this is what would have happened. So unfortunately, live television made algorithm 2 a little bit difficult to actually carry out without the potential for making a sort of a fool out of one or more children. But it does seem to be a lot more effective. But you see the simplicity of this. All we're really doing is we're actually changing the two orders of the algorithm, the two steps of the algorithm. And the advantages you get from that are massive in terms of the computation. And that's a very, very simple example. But it turns out that you can apply these kind of ideas to much more complex, sometimes much more abstract situations. So let's talk about a sort of a simple algorithm, rejection sampling. Okay, F is it? We're interested in simulating from F. Instead, we simulate from G, and we have a bound. F over G is bounded by K. So the algorithm is you simulate from G, and you compute an accept probability F over KG. And then basically you draw a uniform random variable, and you accept X if P of X is bigger than you, otherwise you return to 1, okay? So this is an algorithm that we'd use in our elementary simulation 101 class, and this is what we would say the steps are. But there's at least 2 steps there that are problematic, the red steps. Okay, so first of all, the simulation from G may be expensive, It may be high dimensional. It may even be infinite dimensional in some situations. So we may not actually find one easy, even though G may be somehow an easier density than F. Secondly, computing this accept-reject ratio may be very expensive. Okay, so both of these steps are expensive, and there is some scope for changing the order around here. So, for instance, the step 3 just involves simulating a uniform random variable, and we could do that at the beginning if we wanted to. Okay, so let me give you a situation. So red steps you can sometimes get away without, and so let me give you a slightly different version of the rejection sampling in a slightly different order. So this is retrospective rejection sampling. Okay, so imagine that your simulation is on a very high dimensional space. So X lives on a high dimensional space. But I'm going to start off by simulating from V, my sort of random seed for deciding the accept or reject. Well, one of the random seeds at least. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of, this may be, you may think this is difficult to do, but it turns out not to be so difficult in many situations. But I'm going to identify, having simulated this random V, I'm going to identify a function H, which is a function of V and X, and a set A, which is a function of V, in such a way that if I
Olha que
take
palestra legal, ele é britânico, ele trabalha na UF, né?
Sorry for that. Someone was with my token.
Okay, so that's fine, no problem. Yeah, just in such a way that if we actually marginalize over V, then we get the correct acceptance probability P. Okay, so this seems very complicated, but the point is that HVX may be a much simpler, smaller dimensional random variable than X itself. So you only need to, in step 3, if you can actually do this simulation step of HXV, then actually maybe you can actually get away without actually having to simulate on the X space at all. So all you need to do on step 4 is decide whether HXV is in A or V, and then you accept. Otherwise, you return 1. And you can just work out that actually this gives exactly the correct acceptance probability. And if you need to know more information about X, then you can fill in the missing bits from the distribution of X given H. Now this algorithm, sounds quite complicated, but it turns out that it can solve many sort of infinite and high dimensional simulation problems in a way that you just couldn't do without sort of a retrospective sort of a perspective. But is this useful in any situations? Well, we've used this in many situations in the last 20 years or so to solve problems in intractable likelihood, exact simulation of stochastic processes, Bayesian non-parametric problems, infinite dimensional MCMC, and Bayesian inference for stochastic processes. So some of the people who've worked on this, I've written down there, including one person in the audience now. But I'm going to actually, for this talk, I'm going to now concentrate on a different application of this, which is which is kind of in many ways even simpler, right? So even simpler than the rejection sampling algorithm. So we want to simulate now from an event I of probability P. Well, we know that the simple way of doing this is to get a uniform random seed and to look at the indicator function of U being less than or equal to P. Okay, so we know that I has probability P, but what if we don't know what little p is? We don't know what this probability P is, or it's very, very expensive to compute. Can I come up with some other algorithm? Well, it turns out that yes, I can. So the simple thing we can do is we can actually say, let's find a random variable capital P, which is an unbiased estimator of little p, with the proviso that capital P is also between 0 and 1. Okay, so in this, if I now look at the uniform distribution, so the indicator function of the uniform less than or equal to capital P, then it's a two-line calculation that I hat also is an event of probability P, little p. So interestingly, I can actually compute an event of probability little p without computing little p itself. Okay, so this is kind of very important for intractable likelihood type situations where you can't actually calculate your likelihood, but you may still be interested in simulating from events proportional to that likelihood. Okay, so it's sometimes easier to do the simulation than it is to actually do that calculation. Now we're going to look at a slight generalization of this, and this is very much now moving more towards the idea of a ball draw, which is the kind of draws which are used in football competitions. So now we have probabilities P1 up to PK, which sum to 1. And I'm going to sort of assume that I can produce random variables R1 up to RK such that there's a constant capital M with the two properties there. The two properties are that each of the RIs is an unbiased estimator of this multiple of PI, and in such a way that basically if you sum the RIs, then it is deterministically equal to M. Okay, so I'm getting an unbiased estimator of a multiple of these probabilities, and then I have the restriction, the sum of the RIs is actually equal to M. Apart from that, I can have any kind of structure of dependence or on the RIs as I like. Then, the analog to what I had on the simple Bernoulli random variable case, if I just let the random variable X be equal to I, if this condition here holds, the sum of the RIs up to I minus 1 less than UM less than or equal to the sum up to I of the RJs, then it's maybe more like a 3 or 4 line proof, but it's easy to show that this event X has the probabilities PI. So you don't actually need to know what these probabilities, these P1 up to PK are, if you want to actually simulate from a uniform from these probabilities. And we might actually think, well, why is this relevant for the football situation? Because we're interested in the football situation on uniform draws. But it will turn out to do uniform draws, we actually have to do draws of different discrete distributions. Okay, so that means that we can do this. Now, why might this be useful? Well, we're now going to specialize this to a case where this capital M is actually an integer. Okay, so if the RIs, well, in particular, even more, if these RI random variables are guaranteed to be integer valued, then we can actually do this by a ball draw. In other words, we take this random number Ri of balls of label I for each I into the bucket and then draw one out at random. Then the probability that you draw one out will be a probability 1 over M. And it will then turn out that you're actually drawing from these probabilities PI. So this is a very simple idea. And you can see that it might be useful for drawing from non-uniform distributions if you wanted to have a ball draw, which is what they do for these football competitions. Okay, so now let's now talk about football for the rest of football draws, at least for the rest of the talk. So the draw took place in November and December 2022 in Qatar. Oh, sorry, the World Cup took place in November, December. The actual draw took place on the 1st of April. And the procedure was basically, well, identical, I think, to what they had in 2018. And why do they have such a draw? Well, they have a draw for various reasons. I mean, so the first reason is they want to advertise the World Cup as much as possible and to celebrate the World Cup. The draw is entertaining. I don't think people would watch it if it wasn't entertaining. And in fact, the draw this year was or this particular year was a 2-hour television program, of which I think only probably less than half an hour was actually doing this sort of random draws itself, and the rest of it was showing goals from previous World Cups and celebrating players and teams, etc. So entertainment's very important. It's important to have geographical diversity. So teams don't want to travel from Europe all the way to the World Cup in, I don't know, South America, if they're just going to end up playing against European teams, when they can do that back in Europe. So you want to have diversity. You want it to be balanced in some sense. That means that essentially you don't want to have the notion that sort of teams have incredibly hard draws or incredibly easy draws. Transparency. People are naturally going to be skeptical if you're going to be in a situation where you can't see the randomness actually happening. So they're very keen on this idea of actually putting balls into a bucket and then someone pulling them balls out, because people can actually see that that's a random experiment. And the last thing, it should be fair. And what do we mean by fair? Well, that's what we're going to be focusing on today. By fair, we actually mean that we want to have a uniform distribution over all plausible draws. And the fairness is not something that's very easy to detect, certainly via sort of the ordinary football fans won't sort of even be able to understand the notion of fairness in terms of a uniform distribution on a very high dimensional space. But that's essentially what we need to have. As a statistician, that's the only fair way to, that's the only reasonable way to actually define fairness in this context. So the 32 teams were partitioned into 8 groups of 4. And the groups were decided on the basis of FIFA World Rankings on a particular date, I think about 1 month before the event, apart from the fact that the hosts, Qatar, were also put into pot 1. Now, at the time, Qatar were ranked 51st in the world, whereas all the other teams in pot 1 were ranked in the top 8 of the world. There was one team in the top 8 which didn't qualify. I think that was Italy. And then pot 2 then denoted the next 8 ranking teams, etc., down to pot 4. You'll notice there that there are some sort of alternatives. So in particular, if you look at pot 4, you've got Wales, Scotland, and Ukraine. There were 3 teams here because the playoffs had not been completed because they'd been delayed by COVID. I think actually possibly COVID and the war in Ukraine, or maybe not, but certainly COVID was responsible for some of the other things as well. Okay, and what are the rules? The rules are that each group needed to include 1 team from each of the 4 pots. But every group should have exactly 1 or 2 European teams. And every group should also contain at least, at most 1 team from every other region. So there's no way that Brazil could play any other South American team in the group stage. And the procedure was the following. So Qatar were automatically put in Group A. And then the remaining teams from the first pot were placed one at a time into the different groups. And following that, pot 2 was emptied by taking out a team one at a time, uniformly at random, and then assigning them to the next feasible group. So for instance, the first team from pot 1 was pulled out. And if it was feasible to go into group A, then it would be put in group A. If that was not feasible, according to the rules, then it would be put in group B or group C, etc., until it found a group that it was able to go in. Now, feasible here means actually that the rules at the top are not violated, but also means that actually draws that proceed from that particular positioning all that include there's at least 1 valid draw that would happen from then on. So there's something subtle that has to be done computationally there to actually check that it's feasible to put Brazil in that particular group, to make sure that you don't run into some kind of situation where there's no feasible draw later on. And that all happens behind the scenes via some kind of computational calculation. So once pot 2 has been emptied, then it's repeated for pot 3 and then pot 4. And you might ask the question, is this actually going to produce a uniform distribution over all plausible draws? And the answer is no. And this is an example of the bias that you might that you actually got from this. So Mexico, who were in group 2, actually you could argue that they were advantaged by the draw, because the probability that Mexico got to play against Qatar was 0.125. Whereas if you actually compute the fair probability, it's 0.09. Now you might say those probabilities are quite close. I would actually claim that they're actually quite far away, given that the what's at stake in terms of these kind of competitions. So you might say that this unfairly advantages Mexico. Correspondingly, it will unfairly disadvantage some other teams. So I think European teams were disadvantaged in the sense that I only say this is in the sense that playing Qatar would be perceived to be an easier draw than perhaps playing against Brazil or any other team in pot 1. Okay, so the biases exist and they're really quite large. There are other procedures that are used, but by UEFA, for instance, but they're also equally biased. So what we might do, so let's think about this as a statistician, how I might think about it. The most obvious way to simulate from this uniform distribution would be to use rejection sampling. So we could just use a rejection sampling over all possible draws, ignoring the constraints. Remember, we have the constraints up here in 2 and 3. So we could actually make a draw according to 1, which is a completely sort of symmetric situation, and then ask ourselves, are 2 and 3 actually satisfied? And then actually accept basically that draw if the constraints are satisfied, and if not, just continue. So this is just rejection sampling, and the rejection sampling on the 2022 World Cup would have given an acceptance probability of about 1 in 540. Okay. Turns out that the 2018 World Cup would have given a rejection sampling of something more like 1 in 40 or more 1 in 50 or something like that. So that the actual probability is not really very robust, actually, and it changes depending on which World Cup it is. Now, the rejection sampling algorithm of having an acceptance probability of 1 in 540 is pretty inefficient, but it's still easily efficient enough to do maybe 1,000 draws in a fraction of a second, right? So 1,000 successful draws in a fraction of a second. So in other words, we can do rejection sampling, but rejection sampling wouldn't go down well with FIFA because it completely lacks transparency, and you basically have to do this more or less in a computer to make it kind of reasonable, because I think all football fans would lose interest if you did a complete draw and then you just sort of had to start again 540 times. Okay, but one thing is useful about that. It is useful to know that actually we can do rejection sampling on a computer to actually do these draws, and we can actually carry out many draws really rather very rapidly if we need to. But I think what FIFA really would like to have is a truly sequential and practical solution. I mean, they like the idea of actually drawing teams one at a time and putting them in groups, in the sense that this gives some kind of suspense of a draw sort of evolving and teams kind of evolving according to being drawn in particular ways. But can a sequential methodology be devised that is basically unbiased? This is just to say that UEFA's Champions League, as of every year until this year, has also been biased, and they use a slightly different procedure, but it still has biases, and the biases are no better really than those of FIFA. So that doesn't work either. Okay, so I wanted to give you a simple example to illustrate why these biases actually happen. So here's a simple World Cup. Many years ago, World Cup only had about sort of 8 teams or so. So maybe this is like a historical one. And in this World Cup, I've only got 6 teams. But I'm going to have some of the features of the original World Cup, of the 2022 World Cup, in that I've got Qatar and 2 other pot 1 teams in my pot 1 here. And I've got 3 pot 2 teams as well. And I'm going to also assume that I have the constraint that that basically I can't have I can't essentially have 2 South American teams in the same group. So there's only and I'm going to have groups of size 2 here. So it's not really really very exciting because it's essentially just playing one team against another team. And so, of course, I mean, because of this constraint, you can't have Brazil playing against Uruguay, and so therefore Brazil have to play against either Switzerland or Mexico. And you can obviously, in the simple case, enumerate all of the possible draws. There are 4 of them, and these are the 4 draws here. So the interesting thing is here that actually Qatar plays against Uruguay in 2 of these draws, D3 and D4. But Qatar plays against Switzerland or Mexico in only 1 of those. So the true probability that Qatar plays against Uruguay should be a half, and that should be a quarter for the other 2 teams. So this suggests that what if I wanted to do this, and suppose, so if I'm just going to denote here a bit of notation. P is the probability measure associated with FIFA's draw. So FIFA's draw would essentially just take a team at random for Qatar to play, and it could play any of the 3 teams. So it would actually pick D1, D2, and D3 with probability. So we'd pick. Sorry, we'd pick. Yeah, what would it pick? It would pick D1 with probability a third, B2 with probability a third, and it would pick the other 2 with probability a sixth. And that's nowhere near uniform. What we actually want is for each of them to be drawn with a probability quarter. And so that's actually producing quite massive draws, biases as a result. But we could easily fix this, right? So what we could do is, since Qatar is the first team to be drawn, so what we could do is to essentially let me go back to this. So what we could do instead is actually, when we're actually putting balls into the pot to decide who Qatar plays, I could actually have 2 balls instead for Uruguay and only 1 ball for Mexico and 1 ball for Switzerland. And then everything would actually work out fine. And so in this case, the FIFA draw gives a problem, and it won't give the correct answer at all. But it's very easy to fix, and it's easy to fix by just having two Uruguay balls. So the question is, can we actually somehow fix the FIFA draw by actually having maybe a different number of balls at each turn? Okay, so this is essentially, I'm sort of going through this a little bit quickly because I want to move on a little bit. So this is what we're essentially doing. So when we're actually deciding who Qatar should play against, the probability that I pick Uruguay, well, it should be should really be the number of draws, valid draws, which could emanate from picking Uruguay to play against Qatar, divided by the total number of valid draws that could emanate from now on. This is the true probability that I should be picking Uruguay to play against Qatar. Okay, and in this case, NU was 2, and ND was 1, and NS was 1. So this suggests that I should have actually 2 balls of Uruguay and 1 ball for the other 2. So this suggests that we could do this for a larger draw. Maybe what we should do is compute the number of possible draws that could emanate from picking a particular team, Brazil, in a particular place, and divide it by the total number of valid draws that could emanate from now on. So in principle, you could do this for any draw. But in practice, if you did try to do this for 2022 World Cup, you'd actually to work out the number of teams to play against. To work out the team playing against Qatar from pot 2, you'd need to put in something of the order of 5 times 10 to the 14 balls into a bowl to actually draw from. And clearly that's not practical. So is there any way in which we can make this whole procedure practical? Okay. So now we're going to use the algorithm that we were talking about earlier in some sense. What we want to do is we want to, given that we've done a draw so far, partial draw, and suppose that NJ is the number of ways of completing the draw which puts J into the next pot, then what we actually want to do is we want to achieve picking J with this probability NJ over the sum of the NJs. But can we actually find some way of doing this without having the total number of balls being the denominator here, the total of the sum of the NKs? But what we can actually do is maybe we can do this randomly. So what we want to do is, but suppose we decide to choose capital M balls in total. Then if we just let sort of RJ be the multiple of PJ, M times PJ, then what I want to do is I want to choose a random variable RJ, which is integer valued, which has an expectation RJ, with the constraint that the sum of the RJs actually equals to M. But we don't want M to be too large. I mean, we can actually take M to be very small. I mean, one way of doing it is we could take M to be 1. And if we take M to be 1, well, essentially, we're just going to essentially be doing all the randomness in choosing which team to put in the pot. So that essentially there'll be no transparent randomness. But so what we actually decided in our construction was that we would have at least 1 ball for each type, for each team J, that could possibly go in this particular location. And it turns out that what you need to do for that is to take capital M to be the maximum of 1 over the probabilities. Okay. And then you can actually produce a very nice kind of stratified sampling scheme, which produces a kind of low variance, minimum variance way of choosing a number of balls to go of each particular type, in which we can insist that there's at least 1 ball of each team that could validly go in that position. Okay, so the algorithm looks a little bit complicated. Essentially what you do is the first thing you do is you look at, we've already determined, since capital M is large enough, that the floor of RJ, the integer just slightly less than RJ, is bigger than or equal to 1. So I'm going to put some balls of type J into the bowl of this number. And then for all these remainders, I'm basically going to be assigning those to some uniform random draws. So there's some uniform random draws to essentially define on the kind of fractional bits that are left over. Okay, and it all seemed quite complicated, but it turns out to be quite a simple thing to do. And then essentially I put a random number of balls in each bowl. Okay, and then what I do is I take out a ball and with a probability 1 over the number of balls, and then the marginal probability of that will be the correct probability, without having to ever actually calculate all these probabilities. Okay, so this gives you an unbiased procedure. It's a completely generic way of doing things that can actually cope with any constraints. But there's a big problem here that we actually, in order to actually construct this, we need to actually know what these probabilities are. So when you have a space of possible draws, which is of the order of sort of 10 to the 15 or whatever, this is not a plausible thing to do. And in fact, you can actually construct algorithms to actually calculate these probabilities, but they're not things which can be done in real time. So you need to know what these probabilities are at each step, and these probabilities are going to change at each step as well. Because when you've done a partial draw, there's going to be a new set of probabilities you have to actually compute. Okay, so this is problematic. So what are we going to do therefore? Well, now we're going to go back to retrospective simulation. So retrospective simulation is always our friend when we can't calculate probabilities. So how are we going to produce unbiased estimators of these PJs? Well, it's simple. We said before that on a computer, we can actually do rejection sampling from these probabilities, and we can do that in a fraction of a second. To produce unbiased estimators let me just go on. So you get to produce unbiased estimators of these probabilities. So here I've got PJ hat is our estimator, and I can produce this by doing something like 1,000 rejection sampling draws on my computer from the true distribution. Okay, that just involves us simulating about 540,000 draws, and it'll turn out about 1,000 of them will be accepted. And from that, we can actually compute these probabilities. We can actually produce unbiased estimators just by looking at the proportion of draws of the proportion of draws which draw J next. I should have divided this by the total by 1,000, by the way. So this is okay. And then essentially the whole procedure can work exactly as before. I choose a number of balls, M hat, which is the maximum 1 over the estimated probabilities. And I want to essentially have an expected number of balls to RJ hat to be M hat multiplied by PJ hat. And that algorithm there, I'm not going to go through it, but is identical to the procedure that we had when we actually knew the true probabilities, but it works from the estimated unbiased probabilities, the PJ hats. Okay, so this works. I mean, it has in a sense that it produces an unbiased draw, and I can't. I'm not going to go through the proof of that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how this works. So I'm hoping that I might need to change the screen I share now. But so what can you see now? Can you see the draw?
No.
No. Okay. So I need to I need to stop share and to share a different screen. Excuse me a second. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So right. Okay. So this is if you're interested in doing this is on Jeff Rosenthal's webpage, and I'll give the web link later. So essentially, how does it all work? So this is how the draw works. Qatar is put in Group A. Then you choose the next teams according to this list. And we know that France is going to go into Group H. But as soon as I put in France, what's going to happen is my computer is going to actually do my 540,000 simulations to work out the possible teams that Qatar can play against, given the information we've seen so far. And then it's going to produce my unbiased estimator of the number of balls and then it's going to produce a number of balls, which is an unbiased estimator of the multiple of the number of the true probability. So what it's now going to do is it's going to produce this. So it's going to tell me that basically for the next draw, I need to have 2 Denmark balls, 1 Netherlands, 2 Germany, 1 Switzerland, 2 Croatia, and 1 Mexico, etc., etc. So these all go in the pot to be drawn, and one of these 12 balls is drawn at random. Okay, and this is where you'd get your celebrity, you'd get Messi or someone to draw the next ball out, and it could be one of these 12 balls. And it turns out in this particular situation, it was Uruguay. We proceed then, and it essentially does Netherlands, and then everything happens. And then, so the computations are, you can see instantaneously. It's all done in Java, so it's done on your computer. So this is all happening on my laptop, and it will basically do that, and it will proceed through all the teams that it could possibly play. Now, here's a really interesting one that we actually have here. That it's actually deciding that it needs to put very large numbers of European teams. And the reason for this is because we actually have quite a lot of groups already. Belgium and Netherlands already have 2 European teams. Portugal and Switzerland have 2 European teams. So you can't have European teams going in B or G. So they've got to go in the other group. So they're much more likely to go in the groups which don't have European teams. So actually, if FIFA were doing this, they would give an equal probability to Serbia, Senegal, Tunisia, Morocco, and Poland. So a probability of 1/5 to each of those. The probability of Serbia and Poland should each be very close to a half in the true probabilities. There's a massive, massive bias being made here in terms of the marginal probability of a conditional probability of who goes in next here. It turned out it was Poland in this case, and it proceeded in this way. Okay, so that's how the ball works in that way. I'm not going to show this website again in this talk, but just to say that there are other kind of interesting ways of doing an unbiased draw, which you can actually find from this. In particular, there's an MCMC solution, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so I'll stop sharing that one. And I'll share again my original talk. Too many windows open here. I think maybe I've inadvertently closed it. What can you see now?
It's opening here. It's all black in my.
All black, yeah, that's weird. Sorry, apologies for this. Okay, I think we might be back.
Yes.
Apologies everyone for the delay. Okay, so this is how the algorithm would work, and it produces unbiased, and it's a feasible kind of procedure to carry out. There are some sort of interesting things. I mean, mathematically, it's actually possible that you might have to have a very, very large number of balls, but you can actually make that negligibly small. You can make that sort of small, as in exponentially small. And so you can make the procedure pretty robust, so you don't have to have kind of very, very large numbers of balls. The more internal rejection sampling simulation that you do, again, the more robust you can make it and the smaller number of balls that you can actually have. And the number of balls that you actually use is a kind of compromise between feasibility in terms of you don't want to have too many balls and actually transparency, basically wanting most of the randomness to be essentially done in the studio. Okay, just to say, there is another sort of solution to this, which we talked about, which is an MCMC solution, which I think is, strangely speaking, strangely, I think there are interesting ways in which you can actually do an MCMC algorithm for a football draw. And it's quite feasible, and I think it's something that could be made potentially exciting for a football audience. By essentially by slowing down the MCMC iterations and doing them by a ball draw, sort of maybe for the last sort of 20 or 30 iterations or something of that kind. That's definitely something that's I think feasible, but that's very, very different in style from the sort of traditional draws that are being carried out. Okay, so I just want to finish with a bit of discussion. So we also have a sort of other solutions for this problem, something we call a multiple live solution, which is probably not very feasible and wouldn't be very attractive to sort of FIFA, which is why we've concentrated on the two that I talked about. All of these procedures use two types of randomness. There's randomness that happens in a hidden way on the computer, and then there's basically randomness which you can do in the television studio that's producing the draw. Okay, and you can actually quantify in terms of, a natural measure like the expected conditional variance, how much of that randomness is happening in the open, i.e. in a transparent ways that we would like. And typically far greater than 90% of this is happening. But it's definitely the case that, you have to do some random simulation within the computer to make this work. Two types of random simulation. One is the estimating the probabilities, the PJ hats, and the other one is actually deciding on exactly how many balls you actually put in each pot. So there are two types of randomness that actually have to be done. That if you actually run the same draw on your computer, then clearly the number of balls that you have will be different every time. They may not be very different, but they could be. They certainly could be slightly different. At the moment, we don't have any practical and fair solutions which only use transparent randomness. I don't think they'll be feasible. At the moment, FIFA don't seem to mind too much about having biased draws. I don't think they fully understand that they have biased draws. And one advantage that they have is that since every World Cup draw is unique, and you don't really know who's going to be advantaged or disadvantaged until very, very close to the event when all the seedings are announced. It's difficult to say, well, one particular team is essentially going to be unbiased systematically. So even though European teams were perhaps systematically, certainly European teams from pot 2 were systematically unfairly biased in this World Cup, it could be that in the next World Cup they are actually they're actually favourably biased. So so the advantage that FIFA have in that respect is that there's no point a team complaining after the draws actually happen, because you're not going to get it redone, and the team may not be interested in complaining then anyway, because the next World Cup they may well have the advantage on their side. But these kind of procedures may well, but if you look at things like the Champions League draw in Europe, this is something that has much more repeatability in the sense that the same teams happen to be in the draw most years, and there's only sort of relatively slight changes for some of the countries, so some of the clubs. So football authorities maybe don't care about fairness, and when I spoke to the scientific director at FIFA, his attitude was, and he was very polite. He said, this is very interesting. We're very interested in this kind of work. But their view was very much that they wouldn't change the way they were doing draws until teams started to complain. So it really was kind of politics of the teams themselves, which is probably the only thing that could lead to sort of a change in the mechanism whereby they did this. The draw. There's a link where you can actually find the draw itself, the one that I showed you, and you can also find the MCMC draw there, and you can actually play around with that. And if you're interested in simulating many draws, then that's something you can do. And then I just want to say something about ongoing work. I mean, so those of you that follow European football, the new UEFA Champions League has a very exciting new structure involving 36 teams playing in one common league. Every team plays 8 teams, 2 from each of 4 pots, deciding according to UEFA rankings. The various constraints due to the nationalities, winter weather constraints, and various other kind of constraints are even more complicated than the constraints in the FIFA World Cup. One of the other issues here is that since you're only playing 8 teams, there are serious problems in the sense that you need to make sure that you can timetable everything to fit into 8 weekly slots. Okay, and so it turns out that many draws are not feasible because of that last constraint. In fact, almost all draws that you would actually construct according to the kind of nationality constraints would actually not be feasible because of the scheduling constraints. And I'm just showing you, so basically all the teams are put in one long league, and you can see there's 36 teams there. Just to show you this is the top of the league as it is this week, just because my team's the top, so I thought I'd want to share it with everybody. But there are, I think, 36 teams, and the top 8 will qualify for the last 16, and then the next 16 teams will qualify for the last 32 for the last 32, and then they will play off to get into the last 16. And so this is a very nice and exciting new structure, but it is far more complicated in terms of this kind of structure of how to do the draw. And the draw, because the draw has to be integrated with the kind of scheduling constraints. And it turns out to be so complicated that actually you can't do rejection sampling. There's no sensible rejection sampling that could work for this particular problem. And we're working on this at the moment, producing algorithms for doing this. What was UEFA's idea? UEFA's solution to this was to do everything on a computer and to essentially sacrifice all transparency. And this is a complete cop-out. You can do this. They do this in a way, but they also do this in a way which is biased. And if anyone watched the draw, it was quite amusing. Cristiano Ronaldo, famous Portuguese footballer, his job was to press a button. You can see the button in front of him there. He had to press this button every time to allow the computer to reveal a little bit more of a draw. And during the program, what was very amusing was he got very bored. He looks quite bored there, and he's just told at various times to sort of press a button. So rather than to pull a ball out and to actually say, I've got this particular team, he was just essentially nudging the computer. Just to say that I think UEFA's solution to doing the draw was, I think, not a great success, and we're currently working on procedures for a much more transparent and a fair procedure for actually doing the draw, which we hope to present to UEFA sometime next year. And so they probably won't be interested in fairness, but they may be interested in something that's a bit more transparent at least. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gareth, for your time. Very interesting, but as you mentioned, how interested are the authorities on this? Because they don't care. They just want a spectacle sometimes, and could be really biased. And I assume they don't bother. But if the teams do, like FIFA, as you said, maybe then they have enough pressure politically to move it around, right? So I will open for questions. We may have time for a few questions. Feel free to ask questions.
I'll ask.
Okay.
Hi, Gareth. Thanks for the talk. So the first is a non-technical question about what you're just saying. So if it comes to a point that FIFA or UEFA do have to worry about this because teams are complaining, have you paved the way that they are gonna come to you for the solution, or you think they
no, not yet.
big company for millions of pounds?
So I don't think. Well, at the moment, I haven't approached UEFA. I've talked to FIFA about their draw, but I think the problem is that I don't think teams are going to complain about this unless they're systematically going to be disadvantaged every year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is almost certainly not going to be the case with the World Cup, because the World Cup is sort of different every time. But for the Champions League, I think this could happen. You have 4 or 5 teams from England playing every year, and if it turns out that they have a higher probability of playing against Real Madrid and Barcelona, I think they'll be unhappy about this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be honest, I haven't done that exact calculation, but that would be an interesting calculation to do. Because you can bet your life. I mean, Argentina. Barcelona and Real Madrid will be in the Champions League all the time, and so will Manchester City and Arsenal, and probably Liverpool, probably Chelsea, and so you can compute these things, and there might be of interest. So, yeah. So I think we have a strategy for approaching UEFA, and it's not a direct one in the sense that we are going to go and approach the company that work with that basically produce the solution for UEFA. But we'll have to be quite diplomatic, because I think I mean, our opinion of the current draw is that it's really poor. It doesn't satisfy any of those criteria that I mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah.
At least the FIFA draw has the sort of transparency and the excitement and all that kind of thing. I don't think the UEFA Champions League draw had any of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of issues which are not really very mathematical, I think, which will decide whether anyone ever takes any notice of this.
Mm-hmm. I see. So about the number of like the sample size when you're doing the unbiased estimate,
Yeah, yes.
can you if you have a criteria to, oh, I mean, in a sense, you'd like that the team with the minimum number of balls has one ball every time, right?
Yeah, so
You don't have more balls than a lot of balls, but every team is there, something like that.
yeah, so every team is there, and basically you put a minimum number of balls in there first of all, which is deterministic, and then there's imagine that you decided there was going to be 10 balls, right? And for a particular team you had 1.5 was your 1.5 out of 10, so the real probability was 0.15. So you'd put one ball in for definite, and then you've got a probability half of adding another ball. That's essentially. But then you need to couple that with basically maybe there's another team that had basically maybe the other team had a probability 0.85. Maybe there's only 2 teams. Then you'd have to put one ball and 8 balls, and then basically you'd have a probability half. You put in one or the other. Okay, so that's how you would basically do that. It's not in some ways from an aesthetic perspective, it's not very satisfactory because if you have, there are some symmetries that you're not taking advantage of here. So, for instance, if you talk about European teams in pot 2, or South American teams in pot 1, of which there are 2, you need to decide. Basically, they are symmetric. So there's complete exchangeability between Brazil and Argentina. Okay, so it would make sense to actually have the same number of balls for Argentina and Brazil, but actually that's not going to be the case. Not necessarily. It may be, but it may not be the case. And you could insist that it is the case, but by doing that, you would actually increase the minimum number of balls. So we decided that it wasn't a good idea to do that. So you could insist that all the symmetries are respected in terms of the number of balls, but that would then insist on sometimes quite a large number of balls for certain things. And the biggest one is European teams in pot 2 or European teams in pot 1, of which there's often about 4 or 5, So if you're insisting on having 3 balls for Switzerland, then you've suddenly got 15 balls, maybe, just from European teams, and you don't want to do.
I see.
We have one question in the chat. The rejection sample, I think when you get about the UEFA's draw, you're saying the rejection sample procedure wasn't good enough, something like that. He asked, the rejection sample won't work because the sample space is too big.
It's not that the sample space is too big. It's just that the sample space is huge. The sample space is absolutely. I mean, it completely dwarfs the FIFA sample space because you have to take into account all the scheduling. But the distribution that you would generally propose from would be a distribution of all possible scenarios in which one team plays against 2 teams from this spot, 2 teams from this spot, 2 teams from this, and then you'd basically need to reject on the basis of, do we satisfy all the constraints, and is it a schedule-able draw? And even though you can do it in such a way that the constraints are satisfied with a reasonable probability, to do it in such a way that you can actually schedule that draw has a vanishingly small probability. I can't remember what that probability is, but we did do some calculations. So it is very, very, very difficult to do it via a rejection sampling algorithm because acceptance probability is just too small.
I see. So thank you, Gareth. I think Anyone else has any more questions?
Marcus,
Yes.
can I ask Gareth? It's not a technical question, Gareth. Well, somehow, but all these things are dependent on the ranking. So the pots in the beginning depend on the ranking, and I think the fairness also considers the ranking. So my question is, well, the ranking is controversial. So to which extent the ranking construction can mess up with all of this?
Yeah, well said. I mean, so I think the ranking can definitely. I mean, obviously not directly in the sense. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that the rankings are controversial, and you know, people probably construct better ways of doing the ranking. You could have some ELO ranking or something like this. But the biases are really based on what grouping you're in. Basically, there are various kind of groupings. So, for instance, if I look at South American teams in group in pot A, or European teams in pot A, then these are or Qatar. There's really just three groupings in pot A, and they will all have biases which are common. They're in common. So basically, anything that disadvantages Brazil would disadvantage Argentina if you have the same criteria for bias. And so the sense in which the rankings can, and it could be that European teams in pot 2 are disadvantaged, whereas European teams in pot 1 are advantaged. In fact, I think that was the case this time round. So I think the rankings only really are affected by this bias in the sense that they will make it more likely that you're in one pot or the other pot. But it's really what pot you're in and what continental grouping you're in that really, I think, determines the biases. And the frustrating thing is when we get to 2026, the biases will be different, right? So it could be that Mexico are disadvantaged. I don't even. Where is the next? Does anybody know what the next World Cup's going to be? Oh, it's going to be.
I think it's Mexico, US, and Canada. It's something.
Of course, yes, it is. Yeah, yeah. So that's going to be interesting because there's going to be 3 host countries. So presumably, all 3 host countries will be in pot A. So that so that could create some quite interesting effects there.
All right, thanks, Gareth.
Okay, so let's thank Gareth again. Thank you, Gareth, for your time and for the opportunity. I'll stop the